All right. Hello, everyone. I am Alex Lim, your host, and welcome to AuthorStory, the home of authors and stories that matter. This episode's featured guest is an award-winning radio and print journalist, Sandy Tolan, who is the author of The Lemon Tree, An Arab, a Jew, and the Heart of the Middle East. So, Sandy, welcome to AuthorStory. Thank you very much for being with us.
Thanks for inviting me, Alex. Good to be here.
You're welcome. So, Sandy, first off, your background. I mean, you've written for over 40 newspapers and magazines, such as the New York Times, Los Angeles Magazines, USA Today. How did you get here? I mean, first off, how did you get here? Were you like interested in journalism even as a kid or as a teenager?
I grew up in Wisconsin, and I was a big sports fan of the Green Bay Packers, and my initial fantasy was to be an announcer for the Packers,
Okay, all right.
play-by-play. But as I grew up and went to college, I started getting more and more interested in covering issues, and being able to tell the story through people's voices, whether it's literally through their voices on the radio, or just have their stories come through in what I was writing. That became more and more of interest to me, and I started my career as a freelancer out in the Navajo and Hopi country in Arizona, and then started going down to the U.S.-Mexico border, did a lot of work in Latin America, and then eventually, about 25 years ago, started reporting extensively in the Middle East, and I've been to Israel and Palestine now probably 20 times over those 25 plus years.
Wow. Okay. All right. And no, I got, because I mean there are really literally thousands of different issues. I mean that you could cover, you could report. What attracted you in particular to the issues that you presently cover, like natural resources, global economy, and the conflict in the Middle East?
Well, there's something to me about the relationship that indigenous people in particular have to the land, and how other forces, global economic forces often, or rival ethnic groups in other cases, struggle for competing claims over that land. I first started working in Navajo country, where several thousand or more than 10,000 Navajos were being forced off their lands. These were some of the most traditional peoples in all of North America. And I realized that part of the reason, at least appeared to be, that they were living on top of a giant seam of coal. And so I started looking at the relationship between natural resources, including water, coal, uranium, oil, and how the lives of people, which should be benefited by the extraction of those resources, instead was often impoverished. And so that was, I learned a lot about power, both literally and figuratively, through my work in Navajo country. I did a lot of work also there about uranium miners who had gotten very sick with silicosis and cancer after mining uranium for the U.S. atomic weapons program, and nobody bothered to tell them what they were doing. It was extremely dangerous and could be deadly, and a lot of them didn't even wear protective clothing. It was a shocking story. I'm still outraged by it. So that was sort of the basis of a lot of the work I did later in my career.
Right. Okay. Okay. All right. So all right. I just to acknowledge that our cat is meowing. She's meowing in the background. Okay.
Okay.
All right. Okay. So I'd like to go on a little sidebar here before anything else, because you're also a professor at the University of Southern California, and
That's right.
you teach radio documentary and print journalism. What is the draw for you to teach, where teaching is concerned?
Well, I mean, it's several-fold. I feel like today we live in a divided country. We live in a fraught world of a burning planet, rising sea levels, just strife and conflict all over the globe. And
Mhm.
I think it's really important to learn the tools of storytelling to convey what is happening in this world. And
Mm.
I feel like teaching is also giving something back, but it's also a way for me to connect with people and share a bit of what I know,
Mhm.
so that they can go out and tell stories in the best narrative way possible. I teach a lot
Mhm.
about how to tell true stories
Mhm.
well, and that's a lot of what I focus on at the Annenberg School at USC, and it also allows me to, make a living while reserving some of my time to do my own work, which is, a real privilege. I feel grateful to have this job every
Right.
day, especially with this economy, in the middle of a pandemic, and with so many other journalists struggling. I feel quite fortunate.
Right. And you mentioned something that, a lot of people don't like. A lot of people don't really associate storytelling with journalism, like with the
Mhm.
newspaper articles and stuff like that. So I'm sure it's rather the link there is it's there and it's not really, really that noticed, I think.
Yeah, I think I'm part of a school of journalism that you might call narrative nonfiction.
Mm-hmm.
I think that there are so many. It's not just what I think. It's clear that there are so many competing websites and news outlets and fake news outlets and Facebook posts and all manner of different websites that compete for the attention of readers and listeners and viewers. And my belief is that if you don't know how to tell a story well, your work will sort of fade into the woodwork a little bit. And
Mm-hmm.
by teaching people how to tell stories well, narratively, everybody loves a good story. And it's one thing that, probably distinguishes human beings from other animals is sitting around the fire back way, way back in the day, like talking about
Right.
thousands of years ago.
Right.
What kept people going? What was the thing that distinguished them from the prey that they sought or the
Mm-hmm.
plants that they boiled and ate? It's story. So much of it is story. And stories connect us, and stories help generate empathy
Mm-hmm.
and compassion and understanding. And boy, could we use a lot more of that these days. So
Right.
that's my little corner of the world, is trying to help young journalists be better storytellers while also adhering to the traditional values of journalism, accuracy and fairness and all of that sort of thing.
Okay. All right. Got that. Got that. Cool. All right. So now, on to subject matter. I mean, it's very obvious, even in the news, that things aren't going well, where relationships between Israel and the Palestinians are concerned. Um, you know, Now people might have an idea about of really what's kind of going on in the news, but they might not have the background, the full background, how this came about. So can you just summarize for us how this mess came about?
Uh, do you have a few months? No, I'm just kidding. Um, well, so one of the things that I think is one of the biggest misconceptions of the Israeli-Palestinian tragedy
Hmm.
is that people, through what they've read or what they've heard, assume all these people, they can never get along. They have been fighting for thousands of years. It's
Hmm.
it's useless to even think about a solution. Well,
Right.
in fact, it's really not an ancient conflict, and it
Uh-huh.
also is not primarily a religious conflict, although, of
Uh-huh.
course, there are three faiths involved: Christianity, Judaism, and Islam.
Hmm.
And they, especially Judaism and Islam, play an important role in the tensions and the struggle. But primarily, this is a conflict that is about 120 or 130 years old, and it's essentially a conflict over land, not
Mm-hmm.
religion. It was born primarily with the birth of the political Zionist movement in the 1890s under Theodor Herzl, who felt that Jews in Europe were not welcomed, and he began
Mm-hmm.
basically campaigning for a Jewish homeland.
Mm-hmm.
What's interesting about that is that Herzl was entertaining all kinds of places. There was discussion of Uganda, Argentina, even Alaska for a little moment in time, Sinai Peninsula, which is in Egypt. But eventually, the popular uh, choice for the Zionists in the early 20th century was Palestine, which was starting in 1918, I believe, or 17 or 18, right after World War I, was under the what was called the British mandate. The British controlled Palestine,
Mm-hmm.
and in 1917, the British issued something called the Balfour Declaration that said that the Jews have a right to their own homeland in Palestine. And
Mm-hmm.
that was really, 1917 was what essentially set the current tensions moving, because after that,
Mm-hmm.
and especially after Hitler came to power in 1933 in Germany,
Right.
uh, Jewish emigration to the Holy Land just skyrocketed. Now,
Uh-huh.
there were already Palestinians living there,
Mm-hmm.
and a lot of them felt like, well, on the one hand, you're welcome, but on the other hand, we don't want you to carve out your own territory for another land. This is our home too.
Right.
And then when the state was finally created, the state of Israel in 1948, after World War II, and
Mm-hmm.
after the newly formed United Nations at the time voted to create a state of Israel,
Mm-hmm.
Palestinians felt like, well, yes, we understand there was a Holocaust and that was terrible, but we shouldn't have to pay for it. We
Mm-hmm.
shouldn't have to give up our lands or live as a minority in a Jewish state,
Mm-hmm.
because the state, according to the UN, the two states, there would be an Arab and a Jewish state in the Holy Land. And the Jewish state, although Jews only owned 7% of the land, they were given about 55% of the Holy Land of Israel and Palestine
Mm-hmm.
in the agreement. So, Palestinians felt like this wasn't fair, and so there was a war starting in 48, and then
Mm-hmm.
that war was known to historians as the First Arab-Israeli War.
Mm-hmm.
Israelis considered it their war of independence, and Palestinians, for the fact that 750,000 of them
Mm-hmm.
fled in fear or were driven out of their homes, their villages, their towns. They call it the Nakhba, or the catastrophe. And
Mm-hmm.
it's that moment in time, 1948, that really set everything in motion in terms of the current tensions. And obviously, those are tensions that haven't been resolved to this
Right.
day.
Right. Okay. Okay. Got that. And thank you for clarifying that this is a conflict over land. I mean, this is not a conflict over religion, as
Primarily, yes, that's
yeah.
true for sure.
I mean, sometimes a lot of the news makes it out like it's Jews against Islam, but really it's about the land.
Yeah, it is, and I mean, obviously, there are religious tensions, especially in the holy city of Jerusalem, and
Mm-hmm.
they call the Old City. There are many, many religious holy sites, sacred sites to all three of the main religions in that region: Christianity, Judaism, and Islam.
Mm-hmm.
But really, if you look, for example, at what's happened over the last 25 years, or a
Mm-hmm.
little more, 27 years, 1993 was when the Oslo peace process was declared. And this is when Palestinians made a huge compromise and agreed to a state on only part of traditional Palestine, which is
Mm-hmm.
what they were fighting for, was to be able to return, have those 750,000 people, as the UN declared, in Resolution 194 that they would have the right to return to their homes. Well, the Israelis destroyed more than 400 villages specifically so that the refugees could not return. And in 1990, in the 1993 Oslo Agreement, the Palestinian Authority essentially agreed to give up that claim and agree to a state on just part of that land, on 22% of that land, which is basically the West Bank and Gaza. But Israel continued to colonize the West Bank with settlements. And under the so-called peace process over those 27 years, the number of West Bank settlements more than quadrupled, and they built all these roads and infrastructure, military bases, and jeep patrols, and suddenly Palestinians were essentially under a continuous occupation, where they were confined to cities. Kids, traveling, for example, across, from one city to the other, say if they were coming back from a music lesson or whatever, just trying to travel, were restricted by checkpoints, hundreds of checkpoints. So this is what has impeded a solution, especially over these last 27 years.
Right. Okay. All right. So the story itself, The Lemon Tree, I mean, this book, I mean, it stemmed from me, a 43-minute radio documentary that you produced. Can you tell us a little bit about that documentary and how you uncovered the story that would become The Lemon Tree?
Yeah, well, so back in 1998, it was the 50th anniversary of the first Arab-Israeli war, or as I mentioned before, what Israelis consider the War of Independence and Palestinians, because of this massive dispossession, the Nakhba, or the Catastrophe. I was fascinated by how this one event could be understood so differently depending on who you are and where you were at that time, if you were Palestinian or Israeli or somehow identified with one side or the other.
Right.
And so I knew that, in the United States in particular, the story of the birth of Israel out of the Holocaust as a kind of heroic event in history was very much the dominant narrative. It's the narrative espoused in Leon Uris's mega best-selling novel, Exodus, which was also made into a big blockbuster movie starring Paul Newman. But what it did is it told one side of the story very well, but it distorted the other side. It didn't really allow Palestinians to be fully human. They were considered people who were just aggressive terrorists, didn't have any real connection to the land. And they did have a huge connection to the land. And what happened to them is completely ignored in most telling of this story. And so I was interested in finding a story that would actually tell both stories. And so I actually went in 1998 on that 50th anniversary year, early in 1998, looking for a story. And I interviewed people all over Israel, the West Bank, Gaza, and trying to find a true story that would go beyond the repeated stories of just bloodshed, of exploding buses or children being shot by soldiers with a stone in their hand, and to try to find a common humanity. And, sure enough, eventually I found the story of one house that had had two owners over the years. One was a Palestinian family in 1936. A man named Ahmad Hairi built this stone house in the town of Ramleh. And his firstborn child was named Bashir. And then in 1948, during the war, that family, Bashir and his family, were driven out. Bashir was only 6 years old. And they went into exile, first in Ramallah, then in Gaza. And then meanwhile, in Bulgaria, the bulk of the Jewish population had miraculously been spared of the Holocaust, but nevertheless, they felt it was too close a call, and they almost all of them, or 90% of them, moved to Israel in 1948 and 49. And one of those families, the Ashkenazi family, with their little baby girl Dalia, arrived and moved into the very house that Bashir's family was had been expelled from. And the lemon tree that Ahmad Hayri had planted in the 1930s was now bearing fruit when the Ashkenazi family moved in. And it was only, it was almost 20 years later when Bashir had spent all of this time growing up, wondering who is living in our house and when can we just go back home? That's all the Palestinian refugees wanted, was to go back home. Meanwhile, Dalia grew up only knowing this house. And one day after the so-called Six-Day War in 1967, Palestinians were actually, ironically, able to cross a previously forbidden line and go try to visit those homes. And Bashir and his two cousins ended up at the front gate of the house that Bashir's father had built in the 30s. Bashir rang the bell. Dalia was now not an infant anymore. She was 19 years old. And she comes to the gate, opens the gate, and says to me later, I knew exactly who they were and why they had come. And she had been told, oh, the Arabs ran away because they were cowards. And she kept wondering, well, why would they leave such a wonderful, beautiful house? And there, standing there, was Bashir in his suit and tie with his cousins in the sweltering day. And she knew that she had the answer. They had the answer to her puzzle, as she put it. And instead of sending them away, which part of her mind told her, literally the enemy is at the gate. Instead, when Bashir said, this was my father's house and I lived here too, and could we just come in and see the house? She hesitated and then decided to let them in. And she said, you are welcome, please come in. And that was the beginning of a very, very powerful, rocky and genuine friendship that fostered, that was fostered over the decades to come. And it's, in a way, it's a kind of a metaphor for the possibilities and also the tragedy of the connection between Israelis and Palestinians.
Right. And from what I understand, this is, the relationship wasn't smooth. From what I understand, Bashir, he had some problems, some run-ins, and from what I understand, they didn't talk to each other for some time, but they still maintain a friendship. So how did they manage to maintain a friendship? Despite all that happened to them, despite all that is going on in the region.
Yeah, it's a kind of amazing. It is an amazing story. Bashir's belief in the right of Palestinians to return to their home, which was enshrined in a UN resolution 194, has been ever since he was 6 years old, and he had a terrible tragedy affect him when he was 6. I won't give it away. You have to read the book. But that tragedy that happened when he was 6, combined with how he saw the humiliation of his parents, his father not even having enough money, in Arab culture, to be generous and to invite your friends for a coffee or tea is an essential part of your identity. He could no longer do that. His mother was selling off her gold, her jewelry, in order to feed the family. And this had been a relatively well-off family in its home in Palestine. Bashir's grandfather was the mayor of the town. And so he watched this humiliation, and he formed and hardened his belief in return, the Palestinian right of return by any means necessary. And some years later, he was convicted, although he told me he was innocent. and he's always maintained his innocence, but nevertheless, he was convicted
Mhm.
of having a role in a bombing of a supermarket that killed, I believe, 3 people.
Mhm.
And Dahlia was so, they had started a friendship, and she was so excited by knowing the other, as she would say.
Mhm.
Um, and she was so disillusioned that she just cut off contact for,
Mhm.
15 years while he was in prison.
Mhm.
But she kept thinking, I feel like I should reach out to him, and in the house that I grew up in, and finally now it was empty after her parents had died,
Mhm.
and she was living in Jerusalem. She said, maybe there's a way for us to connect again and decide the fate of this house. It's not just my decision to make. I mean, legally, according to Israeli law, she was able to just do whatever she wanted with the house, but she didn't feel
Right.
that she was the sole owner anymore.
Mhm.
Because of her openness, her empathy, her curiosity, she had come around to thinking that this was the house of two families. And,
Mhm.
in a way, that's a metaphor for Israel and Palestine. It's a land of two peoples.
Mhm.
Dahlia never expanded her interpretation of her own house to define the larger reality between their two peoples. I don't think she was comfortable in going further, and Bashir
Right.
always wanted her to go further. But they maintained a friendship for many years. They're not in touch in recent years.
Mhm.
I've learned relatively recently, and that's partly because that in itself is also a metaphor for the deterioration of relationships between Israelis and Palestinians, and the lack of opportunities for people to actually be physically present with each other, which
Mhm.
is part of the design of recent Israeli regimes who don't want, despite lip service, don't really want a solution that would require them to give up their uh, expropriation of land in the West Bank and continuous building of settlements. And
Mhm.
so it's, the relationship between Bashir and Dahlia has quieted in recent years.
Right. Okay. All right. And the lemon tree, I mean, it died in 1998, but the house that Dahlia and Bashir's families lived in right now, it is a daycare center for Arab children. And I mean, I imagine that given all that's going on, this is kind of a big thing, is it not?
Yeah, it's a moving reality that they have um, found a way to have the home represent something that comes from both of their histories, both
Hmm.
families' histories, and it is a rare thing, and it's an example of what's possible if people set aside their hostility, but as much as one person can make a difference, it's also true that unless the structures of power change or are made to change, then these examples will just be small examples and not structural change that will result in freedom and safety and security for
Hmm.
all the people of the Holy Land, not just some.
Right, right. Okay, gosh, Sandy, this is a very involving topic. And as you mentioned, like early in this interview, like, do you have months? I mean,
Yeah,
it's a big
that's
thing.
true. We could talk for a long time,
Yeah,
Alex.
yeah. Well, unfortunately, this interview is, limited in time and scope. So, in the last minute or so of this interview, are there any last words of wisdom you'd like to share, maybe to inspire listeners?
I would say, that this book that's come out now, it's a young reader's edition,
Mm-hmm.
and it retains the spirit and the voice of the original book that was published in 2006, The Lemon Tree. But a lot of the sort of details of history have been removed, and so it makes for an easier and faster read.
Mm-hmm.
But it's really an example not just of uh, what you can do, in terms of the understanding the rights of all people to have freedom, to be able to breathe free, to be able to travel free, to live in a place that is safe, secure, and free. But it also tells a story that I think is resonant in a lot of countries, including the United States, where we have so many divisions. Just the idea of reaching out to someone else who's not like you and
Mm-hmm.
seeing what's possible, I think that's a really powerful message for our time.
Right. Okay. Well, definitely. I mean, unity over what's that? Separation, divisiveness. I mean, that's got to be something.
Yes, absolutely.
All right. Cool. Okay, then. So, in closing, then, our guest is Sandy Tolan, and his book is The Lemon Tree: An Arab, a Jew, and the Heart of the Middle East, which you can find on Amazon. Now, Sandy, thank you very much for being author story. This is a fascinating topic, and I must say it was great being able to speak with you about this.
I really enjoyed it, Alex. Thank you for having me.
You're welcome. So everyone, check out The Lemon Tree, and of course, go right ahead and hit that subscribe button to get a heads up on all the people and stories we will cover in the future. So catch you guys next time on Author Story, the home of authors and people with stories that matter.